As the dog days of summer settle over the garden, Harry Dodson gathers one flower that brings colour when most have faded. The first varieties of Michaelmas daisy were described as great, straggling, gawky things.
For some reason or other, they've fallen very much out of vogue these last 20, 30 years. There are several reasons for this. Chrysanthemums are much more advanced today than they were. They're a much better subject. Nearly all stocks of Michaelmas daisies get the mildew, which makes them pretty unsightly in a bed, and a bit of a job in floral decorations because you've got to pick all those leaves off.
At the end of the last century, the Michaelmas daisy found a champion in the head gardener at Aldenham House in Hertfordshire. Edwin Beckett's trial grounds presented autumn visitors with a mass display of colour from over 200 varieties. Edwin was the brother of Charles Beckett, Harry's predecessor at Chiltern.
Naturally, I'd never met either of them, but I did have the honour of meeting Mr. Charles Beckett's son on an occasion or two. So to have the Michaelmas daisies here bearing the name and the breeding of Beckett, it's something to be pleased and rather proud of.
A valuable cut flower that filled the void left by the fading summer colours was the dahlia. The dahlia was introduced from Mexico in 1804. The original types had single flowers, but gardeners soon bred double forms, from which almost spherical blooms gradually evolved. As the evenings draw in and night frosts return, artificial heat from the depths of the stokehole must replace the warmth of summer. At the same time, the head gardener must give thought to how he will produce flowers during the dark days of winter. Ashes are collected to cover pots of bulbs. Unlike soil, ashes are free from slugs and snails, who would no doubt welcome being put above a free food supply.
All the way, David. One of the Friday tasks on most of these old places was for a couple of men, or a man and a boy, whoever's task it was to get the ashes and the clinkers out of the stokeholes where coke or anthracite was burnt. Now, these ashes played a very, very important part in the gardens. The bulbs in those days, the hyacinths, the daffodils and the grape hyacinths, Dutch iris, all sorts of things in the bulb line were potted up in August, and they were put into a particular bed which was known as a plunge bed for those plants, and they were buried in this fire ash.
Safe under their blanket, the bulbs will now make good root growth, ready for forcing. In the cut flower bed, Harry has wisely grown several rows of statice, which will provide him with a crop of dried flowers for winter decoration. Picking them at the right time is critical.
This is the statice, the sinuator, and these will be harvested over a period of several weeks. You've got to have the statice out It wants picking in the afternoon when it is completely dry and the flower is out. It's quite papery even at that stage. Tie them up in bundles and hang them upside down and get them dried somewhere where they're going to dry as quickly as possible.
Everlasting flowers, or immortelles as the Victorians called them, have bright, brittle colours. They were often given an extra sparkle to show them off. Jane, Harry's wife, employs a Victorian recipe to achieve this. She dissolves powdered alum in hot water. The effect will come from the crystals that grow as the water evaporates. The book Domestic Floriculture promises a glittering prize. Having poured the solution over them, let them remain for at least 12 hours, and then you will find them dry with a sparkling crystal glistening from every spray. When finished, these are beautiful ornaments and last for a considerable time if kept clear from dust.
Morning, John. Good morning.
The immortelle was true to its name in its widespread use as a funeral flower. When there was a death in the family, wreaths of everlasting flowers were sent to the mansion in advance of the funeral. As on other public occasions, it was the head gardener's duty to make up these wreaths.
Gardeners, of course, of days gone by, as many probably still have to today. I still look after family requirements for it. But in days gone by, they always saw to the family memorial flowers. In the beginning, the base of this wreath is exactly the same as the base of any other wreath that I was taught to make. It's a wire foundation which can be bought. In fact, when I was a boy, old gardeners used to make them up themselves. and it's covered with moss. It doesn't have to be moist because remember you're putting dried flowers into it. The wiring of the flowers is exactly the same as you'd wire a live flower, but the majority of these stems are hard and dry and shiny like a varnished surface, so you've got to wire them a bit tighter than you do an ordinary flower. I put a base around here of Status demosus, which is a lovely white colour. It's fairly solid in the bloom, and it made a good base. And then the helichrysums and acroleiniums were put through the top of this. And when it's put on the ground, you can't see that there's no base there. And this wreath would last for many, many weeks, even out of doors. Several gardeners had the privilege or a perks of being able to make a wreath for anybody on the estate. Usually all you had to buy at my home was the cost of the wires and the foundation, and if you wanted any special flowers, of course, you had to buy the flowers and take them along to the gardener. Sometimes there was one or two members of the garden staff could knock up a wreath and they would do it for anybody working on the estate.
The use of immortals had its critics. One writer spoke disparagingly of wreaths, or rather circlets of yellow flowers, all of precisely the same size, shape and colour. Other flowers were chosen, often to suggest the finer qualities of the deceased. Purity of character and faithfulness found expression in the lily and the violet. But in the teeming cities of Victorian England there was little room for such floral sentiment. Cholera and the exploding population overcrowded London's graveyards. The public were outraged when they learnt that bones were being turned into fertiliser. The response was to create new cemeteries outside the city. At 11 o'clock each day, mourners gathered at a secluded platform on Waterloo Station. They watched the coffin of the deceased carried aboard a railway hearse. They then accompanied it on a 45-minute journey to Woking, to the London Necropolis Company's new cemetery at Brookwood. Here they would travel into the heart of the cemetery along the company's own branch line. It drew in alongside this platform. The station, or in this case perhaps one should say the terminus, was well appointed for the needs of the mourners. It had a rest room, refreshment room and bar, and a small room for the priests, near to where the coffins were placed. It was, as one writer put it, the last great station on the railroad of life. As Surrey Heath became the largest cemetery in Europe, heather, birch and pines, and what the Victorians called trees of sorrow, the weeping ash and elm, produced a landscape where mourners could contemplate the picturesque in a vast garden of sleep. Here they've given immortality to their flowers, hewn in stone. In January 1873, the exiled French Emperor Napoleon III lay in state at the imperial home at Chislehurst in Kent. The Times wrote, "Across the foot of the coffin is laid a large violet wreath." The violet had long been the adopted flower of the Bonapartes. It had also become the favourite flower of England's Queen, so perfectly did it match the mood of her widowhood. Each year, a bunch of the violet named Victoria Regina was sent from Somerset to Balmoral. It was the gift of a loyal subject from Clevedon, a picturesque watering place on the Bristol Channel. He was George Lee, a local market gardener, who found that the well-drained soils of the south-facing hillsides were ideal for early crops of violets. Until the middle of the century, violet varieties were mostly of French origin and not suited to our cool climate. Then hardy stock from Russia gave British growers their chance.
We think this was one of the violet fields long ago.
I joined Jean Burrows, whose detective work identified the site of Lee's nursery. 5 years ago, she stumbled on a mass of violets. Their size and form confirmed their cultivated origin. Remarkably, they seem at home in this wilderness. And among all these survivors, you think you found a clump of Victoria Regina?
Yes, we're pretty sure this is Victoria Regina because it matches all the descriptions and the illustration in Mr. Lee's article. It is a blue violet rather than a red violet. It has broad petals and rounded tops to the petals, and it flowers much earlier than most. And even these rocks are part of the story, you know. Mr. Lee was rather unsuccessful in his early years of growing violets, and he was losing rather than making money. He hadn't learned the success of cultivating to get long enough stems to be able to bunch them for market. And he was so worried that one day on his return from church in Bristol, he stopped off here to have a long think and a pray. And the story goes that he knelt by these rocks and prayed that Providence would show him what to do next.
And did it?
And when he opened his eyes, so the story goes, he saw growing in a bed of strawberries some yards distance the largest and most beautiful violet that he'd ever seen. And because it was a Sunday, and he never worked on a Sunday, he simply marked the spot and came back the next day to propagate this find. And that was the violet that he named after his queen.
Victoria Regina.
That's right, yes.
Through the 70s and 80s, Lee had the lion's share of the violet trade. Tens of thousands of bunches were dispatched each year from Clevedon. In 1883, the Clevedon Mercury noted that our postal bags have become redolent with this once lowly, now queenly perfume. It creeps out of our parcel office to the astonishment of strangers. The French later regained the dominance of the violet market, but Clevedon didn't forget George Lee. Up until the last war, a local chemist was selling violet-scented talcum powder and perfume, labelled Clevedon violets. As the violet grew in popularity, the head gardener had the task of extending its flowering season for as long as possible.
That'll do fine, John. You leave your barrels there. Now each of you get a bundle and bring them to me. This was an old Sussex method I saw. It was faggot wood, as we knew it. That particular estate was placed on the ground, which formed a mild hotbed. Of course, there's no pea sticks, bean rods, hurdle rods, faggots, bavins, whatever you like to call them, copsed on many of these estates today. And of course, nothing in the bavin or the faggot nature was available. I had every other one of a row of black currants cut down, which is a usual practice, and these was bundled up into bundles about the same size as a faggot, and they formed the base. In our case with this, of course, I had to tread it down to get it level and get it solid, because being green sticks, it spread out and is not the same as the bundle of dry wood that the faggot would have been. Bring the barrels along now then, lads, with the leaves. That's the next stage of the operation. Having got the faggots on, of course, then the amount of leaf, the fallen leaf, was placed on and worked down into the brushwood. The leaf stopped the soil going down through the faggots, of course, otherwise you would have needed so much extra soil to fill it up. And they were damp at the time, so of course within a few days they started that gentle fermentation, which would cause the heat. Well, throughout the whole operation, as often happens in the garden, of course, we had the company of the garden robin. And it's always a joy when you're digging in the autumn or early in the spring. The robins get quite used to you, and they will keep quite close to you, and they will pick up the grubs and the worms, and they get quite cheeky, and then they get domineering of their territory. In the winter, especially a day like this when the ground is covered with snow, one automatically ambles and lingers longer in the glass houses, especially the warm houses like this tropical house or stove house. You'd be surprised how the staff will take kindly to sponging plants off to clean them of the summer grime and perhaps to get rid of a bit of bug and that sort of thing.
The Victorians loved to bring shrubs into flower ahead of time. The heat and humidity of the glasshouse turns December into spring.
We're going to lift these prunus now. These prunus have been growing here for a couple of years and they're nicely budded up this autumn. Well, the ground, as you can see, is frozen here this morning, but the frost has only gone into the ground an inch or two, and I can easily penetrate it with the spade. That makes no difference at all. We're going to lift them and pop them up and give them a few weeks in one of the cold houses, and then they will be introduced to a very slight warmth which will advance the blooming of them by about a month. And they can then be used, they can either be cut and used as a cut flower or in a group of plants in the house.